What's up, everybody? How you guys doing today? All right, I had like 2 people. That's cool. That's cool. All right, so I've got some work to do, I guess. That's what you're telling me. Okay, so here we go. Here we'll just jump into it. How about that? Okay, so I'll do the crowd work, and we'll get everyone involved and get everyone up to par and up to speed. Okay. So have you ever met someone who has no filter? Yes or no? Yes. It's not a trick question. Okay, cool. Yes, we've met people who have no filter. The person who says what they shouldn't say, at least not out loud, right? They think, or they kind of maybe speak out what everyone else is feeling or what everyone else is thinking. But the rest of us have the tact and maybe the dignity and the respect to not speak it out loud in the moment. And at least in that time, right? At least not in that company, or at least not in that space. And you know what's interesting about it is when that person that you're thinking of, whoever it is, your family member, your spouse, or your boyfriend, or your girlfriend, or that coworker, or whoever it is that like just kind of out of pocket with their commentary, that person, whenever they speak, it almost becomes kind of a bit of a cringeworthy affair, right? Like they say something and then you just kind of like almost like shriek and kind of like, oh, like you shouldn't have said that, or like that's not what we were supposed to say, or like not right now, like poor timing. And we just kind of, when that person says something, right, like, and it's, whether it's like too soon or like out of line or whatever it might be, we just got to get embarrassed, don't we? Like we get a little embarrassed. And you know what I find funny about that is that whenever that happens, now my wife would tell you that I'm that person, that I'm the person without the filter, that I'm the one that says it even though it shouldn't be said, at least not out loud. My argument is that it should be said. And so anyway, that's a different sermon for a different day. But when that person speaks, when that person offers something, what I find funny is that the rest of us all of a sudden start apologizing as if we were the ones that spoke it, right? Like we're like, oh, I'm so sorry, like forgive him or forgive her, or like she didn't know any better. And like we start almost kind of like a parent, like covering up for our kids' mistakes. And like, you know, because we just feel so uncomfortable when someone is, you know, unfiltered, when someone speaks something or says something that should have a filter upon it. And I'll tell you, listen, it's not just adults or people we know, like kids are notorious for this. Children are notorious for saying something without filters, without thinking through. A few years ago, I remember we had like a handyman or maintenance person in our building come into our apartment to repair something. And my daughter, Gia, was just shy of 3 years old at the time. And so this handyman comes in to fix things as a handyman does. And as a handyman does, he has his butt crack hanging out the back, right? And so he squatted down fixing whatever it was that he was doing, which is, you know, like the total like stereotypical type of thing, right? And so the rest of us would see something like that and we would just kind of like, let me walk to the other room and give him some privacy, you know, and do that. My daughter comes running out of the room and says, Mama, I see booty, and points to the guy. And so the guy like quickly like comes up and he's like trying to ratchet up his pants. And like they come out and there's like no filter whatsoever. And I think one of the funny things to me about this is, again, in that moment, you kind of like feel like, listen, we've been teaching her about like, you know, body parts and making sure that like, you know, like things are dressed and covered properly and all these things. And so like, but that like would have been better left unsaid. Like that would have been better reserved or saved for a time when maybe he left. Like once he was gone, like when he walked out of the apartment, because he still has work to do and now he's dealing with the shame and the scorn of like being mocked by a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. And then we as adults have to like face to face with this guy and say, hey, thank you for showing up. And thank you for introducing our daughter to the better side of you and all of these different things. And so we just kind of have these moments that are like, you know, like that probably should not have been said. And that required a filter of some kind. And that required some sort of, you know, maybe just kind of biting your tongue. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about someone without a filter. The thing about it is that oftentimes they're saying what needs to be stated. They're saying something that everyone else is feeling or everyone else is thinking. And in most cases, what they're saying is not wrong. It's just in that context or in that situation, it just is a bit uncomfortable. It's a bit awkward. It's a bit maybe unbecoming or unfitting for the moment. Now there's those who have less tact and they just say it and you're like, you know what, you probably could say that a little bit nicer. You probably could speak that a little bit better or kinder. But here's what I learned as a pastor. You know, I'm 36, I'll be 37 this year, so I'm like officially late 30s, which is weird. And I don't feel that way, but my body reminds me that it's true. And so I'm moving toward my late 30s. But as a 36-year-old man, I've been a pastor or in pastoral ministry for literally like half my life, since I was 18. And in some capacity, some way or another, I've been doing this kind of stuff, working with church people, families, kids, adults, alike, for literally half my life. And what I've learned is that same way we feel about that filter thing is how a lot of people feel in church. A lot of people in church feel about God and faith. There are things that they're thinking. There are things that they wish they could say. There are things that they're experiencing, things that they're questioning, things that they're wondering about that they feel like, man, I would want to say this, but it would seem kind of inappropriate, or it would feel like a bit like kind of out of left field, or it might just kind of make some people uncomfortable or a bit squeamish, or feel like they would have to be ashamed of who I am or what I'm thinking, and so they would have to kind of apologize profusely on my behalf. And then there's a lot of things that we are wrestling with or that we are challenged with, and that kind of basis serves as the vision for this series that we begin today. And really, the whole heart of this Unfiltered series is to give a voice to those raw, uncut feelings and thoughts that literally all of us have, that all of us think about, that all of us wrestle with or question or wonder or contemplate or have discussed internally, privately to ourselves for fear of, hey, listen, I don't know if I can say this out loud. You see, there are experiences, there are feelings, there are questions, there are things that we have, things that we are holding on to. In fact, some people here have probably been holding on to some sort of thought or question for a long period of time. You've been in church for a long period of time, and you're like, man, for as long as I've been a part of this, there are these things, these issues I have, or these questions I have, or these uncertainties, or these curiosities, or these frustrations, or these, like, I don't know what to make of this, but I don't know that this is a space in which I can bring it. I don't know that this is a space in which I can share this. There are people in this room, people watching online, or people who are listening to the podcast who are ultimately like, yes, that's me. I have questions. And if I was allowed to kind of remove the filter, I would bring them out. I would state them. I would wrestle with them. I would offer them. I would ask for help with them. It's not because I'm trying to be antagonistic. It's just because I don't know or I'm confused by it. And yet, in a church space, it often feels like, well, no, we're not allowed to. Or no, you shouldn't. Or actually keep that to yourself because it might trip someone else up, or because it might set off this conversation, or it might disrupt this program or this situation in which we're involved in, or that we're partaking in. And more than likely, I would imagine that there's probably some people in this room or some people listening who have at one point or another felt like you felt this. If other Christians or if other people in my church, my friends, my people in my small group, the people I talk to, if they knew what I was thinking, my family knew what I was questioning, knew what I was trying to navigate through, in the way that I'm doing it, the raw, uncut, unedited version of it, they would be wholly and entirely ashamed of me and maybe even distance themselves from me. And listen, I get it. I get it because I grew up in a shorthand IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptist. Okay? And that has a whole genre and a whole lot of things associated with it. But the world that I grew up in this kind of independent fundamental Baptist culture and church kind of upbringing was very traditional, was very conservative, and in many ways, very legalistic. Now, listen, traditional conservative, there's nothing wrong with that. So let me be really clear. This isn't about like, hey, let's slam this, or let's kind of say you got to be this other thing. But the world I grew up in was that. And in many ways, because it was legalistic, as I said, there was a lot of kind of like, you don't ask questions. You don't challenge anything. You don't explore for yourself. You don't investigate. You don't cut against the grain. You don't kind of go the opposite. Now, if you know me, then you know that's the last thing I want to do is just be like everyone else. In fact, Krista has a whole library of photos of me doing stuff next to signs that say, don't do this. Like, that's just me. You tell me where's the line, I'm going to say I'm going to cross it just to prove that I can. And so I'm going to push the boundaries. I'm going to push the envelope. I'm going to say, well, why not? I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to investigate. I'm going to explore. I'm going to figure out. And listen, she gets upset because I tell my daughter, I'm like, yeah, gee, I'm like, listen, most of the rules in life, they're arbitrary. Like, they're there because someone said they're there, but they're like you got to understand the context behind it, like to really understand, like, does this really have bearing or significance on our lives? That's just me. Like, that's the way I am. But everything in my upbringing was very kind of like clean cut, was very kind of like, it wasn't that you didn't have problems. It wasn't that you didn't have troubles. It wasn't that you didn't have questions. It's that anytime you experienced those things, anytime you had feelings that were different, anytime you had circumstances that were troubling, it was kind of immediately rebuffed or combated with like these kind of cookie cutter, clean statements. And I'll give you an example of some of them. For instance, hey, just trust in God. Hey, God will never give you more than you can handle. Hey, God is good all the time. All the time, God is good. Hey, be a good soldier for Jesus Christ. Hey, God's will is perfect. Now listen, for most of these, I would say that I agree with them entirely, but they lack context. They're incomplete sentences. And yet anytime someone was having an issue, it's like, hey, you just got to trust God. It's like, don't you understand? That's what I'm trying to do, and I can't figure out why he's doing this or why he's allowing this. It's hard to trust when I'm in the deep end and I'm like treading water and someone like hands me the equivalent of a baby and says, hey, keep this thing alive. And it's like, how do I trust God in this moment? I have nothing to kind of put my feet on. Yeah, like, okay, well, God will never give you more than you handle. Really? Because what I'm going through right now seems a lot more like than what I can handle. And I'm glad that God thinks so highly of me, but I'm not that strong. I'm not that capable. I'm not that equipped. Oh, God is good all the time. All the time, God is good. Yeah, sure. Okay, yeah, I agree with that. But like, hey, what about disasters? What about troubles? What about violence? What about shootings? What about these things that are like real world, realities that we face? And so like to just kind of like put this little bumper sticker quote over top of it really feels like it kind of dismisses what's actually going on. Oh, yeah, okay, hey, be a good soldier for Jesus Christ. Can you tell me what I'm fighting against, or at least help me out so that I'm not the only soldier fighting for Jesus Christ like this? Does it have to be that I'm the only one kind of doing this on my own? And God's will is perfect. Listen, okay, yes, I get it, but listen, in this moment and in this space, I feel like my life, and if I'm in God's will, feels a bit imperfect, if I'm honest. Feels like it's not exactly there. And there's so much of kind of the way that, or the world that I was a part of, maybe the world that you've been a part of, or the perception of Christianity that you have. There's so much of it that you just have to accept it the way it is, or the way that it's been perceived or presented to you. That there's no dissent, there's no questioning, there's no kind of bucking. Certainly there's no doubting, because if there's any sort of doubting that those are true, or doubting that that's the way it's supposed to be, then you're going to quickly kind of ostracized or made to feel like stupid or dumb or not really like you're not as spiritual as the rest of us, clearly. That's why you're struggling. That's why you can't figure this out. And so what happens then is, if that is familiar to you, if that's the culture you've been a part of, or if that's kind of been part of your experience, then what you learn, right, is to just suppress any of those feelings, to suppress any of those questions. And consequently, what we learn is that at best, our experiences and our feelings are just kind of little hurdles to get over. Oh, you have cancer, that family member died, just, God is good all the time. Like, just kind of jump over it. And at worst, it's completely invalid. At best, it's just a little hurdle. Like, you just got to get over this. Just, put a bumper sticker on it, and then you'll be able to power right through and get onto the other side. And at worst, hey, what's wrong with you? Why do you feel the way you feel? So-and-so went through something similar. They don't feel that way. Look at so-and-so. Look at what they've been through in their life. Look at what they've been wrestling with. And they've kind of made it through. So clearly, the problem must just be you. But there are two major problems with this approach. Two major problems with this kind of belief or this practice. And the first one is this. Problem number one is, this is not what we see in the scriptures. Not at all. Nowhere in the Bible are we told to suppress our feelings. Nowhere in the Bible are we told to forego our questions. Nowhere in the Bible are we told to hide or conceal our doubts. Nowhere in the scriptures are we told or instructed to keep our thoughts to ourselves. In fact, it's the opposite. And I'll prove it to you. I'll give you just a handful of examples, okay? Here's where we see the opposite. Jacob, Genesis chapter 32, wrestled with God, refused to let God go until God gave him what he was asking for. Moses resisted God. Exodus chapter 4, read it, man. He is like, God, not me. Nope. God's like, hey, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to give you this. He's like, nope, not me. Send someone else. Multiple times resisting God out loud. Okay, you have Jonah, who, if you're familiar with the story, Jonah ran away from God. God's like, hey, I want you to go here. Jonah's like, nope, I'm going the opposite direction. I'm going to book it to as far away as I possibly can go. Yet Paul suffered thanks to God. Not suffered in pursuit of God, but suffered thanks to God. He admits, by his own admission, he says, listen, I suffered at the hands of God, that it was God's will for me to suffer and to go through these things that I've experienced in my life. Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, were angry with God, angry with Jesus. Jesus, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. To his face. To his face. Jesus, if you had been here. And then David questioned God. In fact, look at the questions that he asked of God. Psalm 13, verses 1 and 2. He says this, "O Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day? How long will my enemy have the upper hand?" Listen, that's in the Bible. That's in the scriptures. And so what we see actually in the scriptures is that people are bringing their challenges, bringing their issues, bringing their questions, bringing their frustrations, bringing their doubts to and before God. No point at any point where they rebuked or rejected or told, hey, keep that to yourself because I don't want to hear it. Here's the second problem. Without truth, there is no trust. Without truth, there is no trust. I don't care what type of relationship you have or who it's with. If that relationship does not have a foundation or a basis of truth, there's not going to be any form of trust. You're not going to be able to experience or have trust. It can be a marital relationship, it can be a friendship, it can be a familial relationship, it can be a working relationship. If you do not have the ability to communicate in truth with another person, you will not have trust in that relationship. See, when we are told to bite our tongues or to ignore our feelings or deny our experiences or suppress our thoughts, then we eliminate the transparency that's needed to cultivate and to produce trust in a relationship. So if the only option is to not be honest with God or to not be honest about where you're at, in other words, to put on a filter, to project or present something that's not real, then you put a cap on what can be experienced between you and God. And if you've been around Meta for a long enough period of time, you know that's not who we are and that's not what we encourage. And you also know that Chris and I have repeatedly said over the years, listen, you bring it to God because here's the good news, God can handle it. God can receive it. God can take it. In fact, he invites us to bring those things here. Because listen, we've all had moments. We've all had moments in our faith journeys where things didn't mesh compatibly with that verse we grew up hearing or with that perception we thought or had of God, where our reality and our faith don't just kind of integrate seamlessly, where there's some friction and some tension and some uncertainty surrounding who we are, where we're at, and what we're trying to figure out or how we're trying to make the most of this faith journey. We've all had thoughts like, man, God, this is messed up. This is messed up. Listen, it's so messed up, God, I don't know if this is worth it. Is it worth it to do the things that I'm doing, to make the sacrifices I'm making, to be consistent or persistent and devout in my faith or in my relationship with you? You know, we've all questioned, right, when something goes awry, like, God, what are you doing? Anything? God, are you doing anything at all? Is anything happening? Or God, I don't know how to tell you this, but you failed. You failed me. Now let's park right here for a moment. God failed me. As I mentioned, I've been pastoring for, nearly half my life, 15 years in a formal capacity, in an official staff role, at least 15 years. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had pastoral conversations with people in church who have expressed or communicated this to me. It's more than I can count. It's more than I care to count. Now, to be fair, they don't say it directly like this or explicitly like this. Instead, they'll say things similar to this, maybe things that you yourself have said. Well, I just thought God would have done blank for me. I thought that if I did X, Y, Z, God would do A, B, C. I mean, I was hoping for, when I made this decision, when I made this commitment, when I made that sacrifice, when I took that step, I was hoping that I would have a different result or that there would be a different outcome. And all of those statements are simply various forms of, God, you failed me. God failed me. Now, for some of you, this might feel really jarring. To see it on screen, to see it in all caps, it might feel like, whoa, is that even legal? Or is that even like, okay? Should I leave before God strikes down the building? Should I book it out of here before lightning hits on this beautiful sunny day? But it's okay. It's okay. In fact, here's what I want us to do. I want us to say this out loud together. On the count of 3, okay? I'm saying I don't do this. This normally it's a little gimmicky. But today, it's intentional. On the count of 3, I want us to say this out loud together. 1, 2, 3. God failed me. Let's say it again. God failed me. Okay, now that you've gotten that off your chest, now that you've said it out loud, what I want you to know is that if you've ever felt this way, if you've ever thought those thoughts of like, man, I just thought that if I did this, God would do this, and that's not been my reality, that's not been my experience, then I want you to know you're in good company. You're certainly not alone. You're certainly not first, and you won't be the last. In fact, I want to introduce you to a guy by the name of Joseph. And Joseph has an interesting story, and we're going to pick up into Joseph's story when he's a teenager, basically when he's about 17 years old. And here's what the scriptures say about Joseph. It says, Jacob, his father, loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. Hey, if you're the favorite child, raise your hand. Yeah, there's a few of them. Look at that. They're proud, man. They are so proud. They are so proud. You know what gets me? This isn't in my notes. This is extra. You know what gets me? I'm the oldest of 3. And my siblings will swear to you that I'm the favorite. And I'm like, if that's true, then why did I take the most beatings? Why did I get the worst beatings? And why did you guys get everything I never got? But the favorites are so proud. Let's see those hands again, the favorites. Yeah, look at this. Look, hey, how many of you love Jesus? They'd be like, how many of you are a favorite child? Like, yeah, that's me. It's like straight to the ceiling. Joseph had many brothers. He was the favorite. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. And one night, Joseph had a dream. And when he told his brothers about it, they hated him even more, or more than ever. Moving on, it goes into this. It says, listen to this dream. Okay, listen, let me just give you some life advice. If you're hated by people, it's probably not in your best interest to like rub it in. To rub in like why you're loved more than they are loved. To rub it in like, hey, let me tell you about how special I am. And listen, you came for a sermon. I'm giving you life hacks. I'm giving you tips. I'm giving you stories. And you'll get a sermon along with it. But listen, you just know, when you're loved more than others and you have a dream that I'm about to read to you, it's better to put on that filter. This is unfiltered, but in this situation, it's better to put on a filter. So he says, listen to this dream. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. And his brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of the dreams and the way he talked about them. So Joseph has this dream, right? And he tells them this dream. Listen, I had this dream. I have a bundle of grain or hay or whatever it is. And my bundle stands up, and conveniently all of yours bow down to mine. Not only am I the favorite, not only am I more loved, not only am I more special than you, but one day, you're going to realize it, and you're going to bow down and say, yes, Joseph, you are more special than we are. Now, it gets crazier because Joseph doesn't just have one dream. He has another dream of kind of a similar tone and similar nature. And so again, rather than keeping it to himself, he just says, hey, we're talking about being unfiltered, so let me go ahead and tell them. And he tells them the second dream, and it's the exact same thing. And his brothers are so fed up with this kid, this privileged brat, saying, hey, listen, what should we do with him? And some of his brothers decide, you know what we're going to do? We should kill him. Reuben, the oldest of the lot, says, listen, I mean, that's a bit extreme. Let's just throw him in a pit. and we'll figure out what to do with them after we have some time to kind of cool off. So his brothers agree, say, yeah, killing was a bit rushed, maybe not the best decision. Let's throw him in this pit. So they throw him in a dried up well. And before Reuben and the brothers can kind of reconvene and have their assembly to decide what's going to happen, some of the brothers decide, you know what, we can make some money off of this punk. And they sell him to slave traders, a caravan of slave traders who are migrating across the region. And they say, you know what, hey, we have something you might be interested in. And they barter off their brother for some coin. 30 pieces of silver is what we're told. So Joseph, this teenage boy, is being transported by these slave kind of migrant traders to a region where he probably doesn't even know which direction he's going in. He arrives to a region in Egypt, and he arrives at auction, and he's purchased or acquired by a man named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was an Egyptian official. We're told he was the captain of the guard, meaning he had a political position and a military position, someone of influence, someone of renown, someone of significance. And so Potiphar takes in this young, scrappy, entitled kid who one day thought that his grain was going to stand above everyone else's grain. And he brings him into his house. And apparently Joseph has a good attitude. He works hard. He's on time. He does all the things he's supposed to do. And Joseph gets elevated to now where he becomes kind of the director or the head of Potiphar's household, overcharged with all of the tasks, all of the responsibilities. And so he's kind of working, and he's kind of worked his way up the totem pole of servants or kind of indebtedness. And he's at the top of this list, overseeing everything, until one day he is falsely accused of sexual misconduct and rape by Potiphar's wife. Joseph didn't do anything. Joseph had resisted her advances, and yet all it took was her falsely accusing him to her husband, to the leaders, and Joseph was now thrown into, we're told, a prison that existed in the house of Potiphar, a political prison. Now imagine for just a moment that you are working in your job, and you're working to oversee the other kind of servants, the other hired hands, the other slaves. And you know that this is a really it's about as good as it's going to get for your life given the circumstances. So you're at the top of your game. And then one day someone says something about you falsely, whatever it might be. And instead of you having the right to a trial or to a fair hearing of any kind, instead, you're thrown into a dungeon, not like an air-conditioned prison in the way that we might think of it today, where you're fed 3 times a day and you have 1 hour of outdoor activity, but an actual dungeon, the dungeon that you actually once oversaw. And so he's thrown into this dungeon, and there he remains for years. For years. Other prisoners would come in, some would leave, some would stay, some would pass away, I'm sure. And Joseph was just there, forgotten. Until one day there's a couple of guys who come in, some guys that served in Pharaoh's court and had kind of political positions or roles, maybe not political positions, but kind of more like in the household of Pharaoh to help the ruler of Egypt. And so they're in, and they have these dreams that they can't figure out. And Joseph's like, hey, I had dreams too. It didn't turn out, but I could probably tell you what they mean. And so he interprets these 2 dreams. And he instructs one of the guys, says, listen, hey, when you get out of here, remember me. Now, interestingly enough, unlike the dreams that Joseph had earlier in his life, these 2 dreams that he interpreted come to fruition. For the one guy, not so good. A few days later, he's impaled and he's killed. For the other guy, he's restored and he's actually elevated to a higher position of influence. But here's the catch. That was the guy that just said, hey, remember me. Don't forget about me when you're on the other side. And it says for years, that guy completely forgot about Joseph. Completely forgot about what had happened. So now Joseph is stuck in this pit. He's stuck in this dungeon. We're talking about over a decade. Over a decade from the moment that he shared those dreams with his brothers to this moment where he's trapped in this prison, where he feels like no one remembers him. His family doesn't care about him. They've sold him off. Clearly, they've forgotten about him. Potiphar, who cares how all the good you did? You messed up, you did something, or you attempted to do something to my wife, so I don't care what you have to say. Now you're just going to be stuck in this prison. Oh, that guy that had the dream, hey, listen, I don't care about you. I'm living the good life. Sorry, Joseph. Enjoy the other side. I mean, you can't tell me that someone in that situation, or that you in that situation, wouldn't feel like, hey, God, you failed me. You gave me this dream. Gave me a couple of them, if I remember correctly. I told them twice to my brothers because I thought they'd be excited. And I thought they'd want to celebrate and just bow down and worship me. God, these were your dreams. And they didn't happen. They didn't come to fruition. So God, I don't know where you're at in this world. I don't know where you're at in this story. I mean, it's easy to see that in Joseph's life, man, that moment, in that circumstance, not just that moment, but for that period of time, the decade plus, that Joseph clearly or surely would have felt like, man, God, you failed me. You dropped the ball here. And I don't know why, and I can't figure it out. Now, things eventually did turn for Joseph. In fact, we are told that the Pharaoh of Egypt, had a dream that he couldn't interpret, that he couldn't figure out. And so his cupbearer, the one who was kind of restored back to his position, says, oh, I remember when I was in that jail that you threw me, and there was a guy I met there who told me dreams, who could interpret dreams, and told me that I would be back in this position. And so they brought out Joseph to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh had this dream of 7 fat cows eating 7 skinny cows. Or excuse me, the inverse. 7 skinny cows eating 7 fat cows. And no one could figure it out. And Joseph interprets this dream, says, listen, this dream means this. You're going to have 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. And so you need to prepare, you need to store, you need to save up. He's literally giving them like an actual stock market analysis for the next 14 years. And Pharaoh releases him from the prison, elevates him, makes him second in command in the whole of Egypt. And so he's restored right there. And so you would think, okay, well, clearly it's just water under the bridge, right? Because at age 30, he's restored, or he's elevated into this position. At 17, he was sold. So 13 years, God, we must be all good now because, listen, I'm living my dream life. I'm fulfilling the dreams you gave to me. But that's not the case. Check this out. We're told that during the first 7 years of his reign, during this time, in Genesis 41, verses 50 to 52, check this out. During this time, before the first of the famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife. So he's married now. Her name's Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Now Joseph, verse 51, named his older son Manasseh, and here's what the name means. God has made me forget all my troubles, and notice this last part, everyone in my father's family. So his son's name means God has made me forget everyone in my father's family. Second son, Joseph named them Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief. Now, I've mentioned my daughter a couple times, and this will be the last time I mention her for today. But her name is Gia, okay? And when she was born, my wife and I, we thought through different names. What do we want to name our daughter? What should we name her? Because this is what we're going to call her for the rest of her life, and this is what everyone else is going to call her. And so what is this? What does she mean to us? Now, Gia means God is gracious. So as a parent, I could not imagine the level of sorrow, the level of frustration, the level of anguish in which I would go and then name my child, God has made me forget everyone in my father's family. So that every time someone calls on them by name, what they are saying is, God has made your father forget everyone in his father's family. Or another son, God has made me fruitful in my land of grief. So clearly Joseph was still hanging on to some pain. Clearly Joseph was still hanging on to some issues. Clearly Joseph was still frustrated and saying, listen, this is not the life. I'm doing what I envisioned, but it's not come the way I envisioned it. Not the way I anticipated, so much so that he was willing to permanently tattoo his children with names that would be forever reminders of the hardships that he endured and the struggles that he experienced. Now, I think this is important because I imagine that there are some people, maybe one person, I don't know, maybe a handful of people in this space or at one point or another who feel like your life is nothing like you envisioned it would be. Who feel like the path you've been on, the journey you've been on, the way things have come about, the experiences you've had, the story you're living is not what you envisioned, is not what you thought was going to happen. And maybe in many ways you're like, I know I'm not like in a literal prison, but I feel like I'm in a figurative prison and that God, you've kind of left me here for dead. I can't move forward. Every time I try to kind of take steps forward, something happens and it pushes me back, it sets me back. Every time I feel like I'm trying to help someone out, they move on with their lives and they forget about me. I look around at other people and they're happy, they're married, they've got kids, they've got jobs, they've got careers, they've got goals, they've got success. And everything that I thought I wanted or everything I thought I could have seems so far out of reach or so far removed from the reality that I'm experiencing or that I'm living right at this very moment. Maybe for others, it's not the totality or the sum of your life, but it's an experience. It's a situation in which you feel like, man, God, you really let me down here. You failed me. You bombed on this. That was a miss. And I can speak to an example or a situation stretching back now over 10 years. In July of 2012, I was a student pastor. I was 26 years old. I was leading a high school summer camp, 150 high school students, about 75, 90 adult volunteers in Central Oregon. And we're there for a week. It's a Sunday through Saturday camp. Each day there was different activities or different excursions. And I remember kind of like the months preparation, like the months worth of preparation and work and prayer and anticipation to get all of this here, to kind of corral all of this together, to bring the teams together, to make this all happen. And so Sunday night comes and the kids arrive on their buses and we're stoked because this is gonna be an incredible week of high school camp. And like, man, this is gonna be so awesome. The kids are excited. The volunteers are excited. By Wednesday, that excitement typically disappeared. But on Sunday, they were excited. And on Sunday, they were ready for it. And then Monday, we wake up, we eat breakfast, we go out for our day. And Monday afternoon, I received a call that forever changed my life. I received a call from another youth leader who was working at a different area or a different activity area in which we would have kids kind of hike down a gorge, down a canyon, toward the base of a waterfall. And I received this call from my friend Matthias, and he says, hey, Ricky, are you free to talk for a minute? And I'm like, yeah, what's up? He's like, you might need to take a seat. Which I've never had anyone ever say that to me on a phone call before that or since then. So I sat down, and he says, listen, Caleb and Brett, we're over here at the falls. Caleb and Brett, they like fell or jumped in or something, and like they haven't surfaced. And it's been several minutes. And the situation is really intense and it's really scary, but you need to get over here. And what he was saying to me was that at the base of this fall, somehow, one way or another, this 15-year-old student in my youth group and this 26-year-old friend of mine had somehow managed to kind of slip or fall into the pool of water just underneath this cascade of waterfalls. And they were submerged. And minutes had passed, and neither one of them had emerged from that moment. And man, I remember in that moment saying, God, this can't be. This cannot be. This is terrible on any day of camp, but this is like the first day, like the kids, we've been like, God, there's no way this is reality. I grabbed another volunteer. I said, hey, drive me over there because I can't drive. I need someone else to drive me. So she drove me. We jumped in her truck. We're driving over. And before we could even make it to this place 4 miles away, I received a phone call and says, listen, this is, it's been X amount of time. I think we need to notify the family immediately because this is really severe. And I proceeded to make what became the most difficult phone calls of my life to inform parents of something, a tragedy in which they thought, wow, a week off, our kids are off at camp, or my son is volunteering, so proud of him. We had to call in a special dive team to retrieve the bodies. Both Brett and Caleb passed away. And I remember thinking, God, you failed me. You didn't just fail me, you failed all of us. You failed Caleb. You failed Brett. You failed their families. You failed these kids. You failed these volunteers. And I remember thinking in that moment, how do you even rebound? How do you recover from this? How do you even navigate this? And here, the crazier part was just like there was that happened, but then for most of the camp, they had no awareness of what took place. So as the kids were coming back into the campgrounds, I was leading the camp, so tasked to kind of lead and introduce or share with the other kids and the other families, hey, situation has occurred, here's what's taken place. We're just putting a halt to everything else going on. And dealing with the questions of why would God allow this? How could that happen? We were here to celebrate God, and now he didn't even show up to protect in this situation. He didn't show up to help in this situation. And whether it's the trajectory of your life or the experience of an outcome or the outcome of an experience, when that happens, when you're stuck in that dilemma of like, God, I've been in slavery for 13 years, or God, I've been in prison for as long as I can remember, or God, this moment you grossly you just missed. You didn't even show up in some way or another. Whatever that experience is, we're left with that reckoning moment, aren't we? Of why? How I thought you were all powerful. I thought you were all good. I thought you were capable. I thought you were worthy. I thought all of these things, and you're just not there yet. God, you weren't there in that situation for Ricky. You weren't there in that situation in my life. You weren't there over that decade. And Joseph, why, God? Why is this the case? And although it might feel like God has failed you, or that God failed me, or that God failed Joseph, I do believe there's something that we can learn, or something that we can cling to. Psalm 105, verse 19 says this about Joseph. It says, until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character. You see, God had to build something up in Joseph so that he could fulfill the calling placed upon his life. God had to increase his capacity. He had to strengthen his resilience. He had to build character so he could carry his calling. Mind you, Joseph was the younger at that time where he shared his dreams with his brothers. He was the youngest of his brothers. So where does a shepherd boy, the runt of the litter, where does he learn how to govern? Where does he learn how to lead? How does he learn to rule in a pasture? God gave him some dreams. God told him he would be in a position of authority. God told him he would have ability and ruling and leadership far beyond his capacity or far beyond his awareness in that moment, so much so that his brothers mocked him and laughed and thought it was stupid. So how does that kid lead in a foreign government effectively? By doing time in a political prison, learning the ins and outs of that government, learning who the Pharaoh is, what he likes, what he doesn't like, learning the customs, the cultures, learning what it means to be disciplined, learning what it means to be stand-up and upright. And so God, until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character. You see, God had to increase his capacity. He had to strengthen that resilience. He had to broaden his character so that he could carry his calling. And the same is true for you too. I don't know what your situation is. I don't know where you felt like God has failed you, but I want you to know that it could be that in that in-between, when it feels like God has failed you, that all he's doing is strengthening your character. It could be that when it feels like God has fallen short or that he's missed the mark, that he's actually building up your resilience. It could be when you feel like, man, God is absent and nowhere to be found in my life and that he didn't show up on time, that actually he's forging your confidence and removing that kind of self-dependence or that insecurity that you've been leaning on for so long. It could be that God is actually expanding your network and giving you the connections that aren't possible or aren't readily available to you in this moment today. And it could be that he's increasing your skill just as he did with Joseph, so that when you step into that fulfillment, when you step into that role, when you step into that calling, you actually have what you need to succeed. You see, the journey you are on is not a failure, but a fulfillment. And there are things that you'll gain on this path that could not be gained or obtained apart from it. And so many times we're tempted to quit or to give up or to get frustrated or to walk away or to say, God, you left me hanging. But God's like, listen, if you just stay the course, if you just stay on the path, there are some things that you will retrieve, some things you will learn, some things you'll be benefited by that will actually enable you and empower you to do the things that I have put you on this earth to do. It might not look like the way you wanted it to look. It may not take you to the places you hoped it would take you to. And it may not feel like it's leading to anywhere important, but I can guarantee you that your story and your journey is not a failure on God's part. It's actually the path required for the fulfillment of God's vision for your life. And so what I want to do is I want to leave you with 2 simple prayers to pray. 2 simple things that you can kind of take away and walk away with from this message. And the first is simply this: God, show me what I've gained. Show me what I've gained. Joseph gained something in that prison. He gained his character, but he gained knowledge and awareness and ability that didn't previously exist. You know, when I go back to that camp experience, July 9th, 2012, that was the first major crisis I ever had to deal with. But notice that I said that was the first major crisis. Little did I know that God would give me an ability, or God would give me an invitation to step into different crises moments, some in my personal life and some at a broader level, and be able to deal with those things, to be able to navigate those things, to be able to pastor and to shepherd and lead others through those things. And yes, that was a tragedy, and it still is a tragedy. And yes, there's some confusion, and yes, there's some questioning, and yes, there's like, well, why that? But there was something that if I just narrow it down and say, okay, God, show me what I've gained through this, that I can see that what I gained was actually preparation for where he was leading me, which is the second prayer. God, remind me of where you're taking me. You see, we often confuse the end of a sentence with the end of a story. And we think, wow, like this must be the end. God's like, no, keep reading. Keep going. Turn the page. See what's next. And I can speak to both Caleb and Brett. See, for the previous year, the year prior to this tragedy, Brett and I had been meeting once a month to connect, hang out, have food, but to sharpen each other. We both grew up without our dads. Our dads were alive, but they were absent, weren't present in our lives. So we met for over a year to just talk, what does it mean to be a man when you don't know what a man looks like? How do we figure this out when we have no examples? And Brett, I would hear him talk about how much he loved his dad and how frustrating and how hurtful it was to feel like his dad wasn't responsive or reciprocating that to his family. His parents had split because of some different things that were going on. And so he just prayed and longed for his dad. To the point where Brett one day shared with me just privately, said, listen, I just wish my dad knew how to be a man. And after Brett's passing, his father, Scott, would have this total 180, not like pushing away from God, but actually drawing back into God. Actually realized that he had lived his life on his own for too long, at the consequence and at the expense of others. And would you believe that Scott and Christy, his ex-wife, ended up getting remarried to each other and restoring their marriage? And it took me back to the second to last conversation I ever had with Brett. We said, man, I would give anything to see my parents back together. And I can't say for sure, but I would be willing to bet that if I were to ask Brett, would you give your life for it? He would have said, yeah. And I think about that 15-year-old kid, Caleb, this kid who was a beacon of light, so in love with Jesus, so passionate. Like we would worship. If he was here, like worshiping, he would just be down in the front, hands raised, singing, shouting, dancing, praising God. And then it's like, man, like he stepped over from one place into another and stepped over into eternity, and he gets to worship. But his dad and his parents, Sean and Sarah, and to see them navigate this journey, and then the opportunities that arose for them to share Caleb's story, to speak its influence. And this is no exaggeration. I don't need to share all the details. But all you need to know is that through this event, through this tragedy, millions of people have heard about a God who loves them, a Savior who restores them, and a hope that's found in the light that Caleb is walking in today. And I look at that whole experience and I realize God was taking all of us somewhere. But in the moment, we lose sight of it. In the moment, we don't see it because all we see is that space that we're in. And so if or when you feel like God failed you, I want you to pray these two prayers. God, show me what I've gained through this and remind me of where you're taking me.